The microphone was already on before Mélanie Joly even reached the podium set up in the main hall of the Fairmont Le Manoir Richelieu on that cold morning of March 14, 2025. The gigantic stone castle erected above the dark waters of the St. Lawrence River seemed to have been built to withstand centuries of storms, violent winds, and historical confrontations. The ancient walls held echoes of past diplomatic meetings, but that day something different hung in the air. The corridors were too quiet. The journalists sensed the tension. The aides spoke softly. The photographers waited as if expecting a statement capable of crossing borders in minutes. The G7 foreign ministers' meeting had just ended. Marco Rubio had already left. Then a question was posed by a reporter at the back of the room. The journalist wanted to know what she had told Rubio about Donald Trump's repeated comments advocating for Canada to become the 51st American state. Mélanie Joly didn't lower her eyes. She didn't consult any documents. She didn't seek a carefully prepared diplomatic response. She remained motionless before the cameras and answered dryly, precisely, and absolutely directly. Canada's sovereignty is not up for debate. Period. There's no discussion. There's no conversation about it. There's no reason to even address this issue. You are here. You respect us. You respect our sovereignty. You are on our territory. You respect our people. Period. It was only a few seconds, but those seconds crossed social networks, international broadcasters, and political newsrooms like lightning. The video began circulating immediately. Within hours, it was being played on millions of screens. But what changed at that moment was not just the viral impact. What really changed was the public perception that Canada was entering a new diplomatic phase, a less cautious phase, tougher, more emotional, more defensive. And there was an important detail that almost no one noticed while the video dominated the headlines. Before that press conference took place, before the cameras were turned on, even before Rubio landed in Quebec, Mélanie Joly had already launched a silent diplomatic offensive within the G7 summit itself. Behind the scenes, she gathered the foreign ministers present and made clear something that many of them still considered political exaggeration. As she would later reveal, several international representatives believed that Trump's statements about annexing Canada were merely electoral provocation, a spectacle intended for American headlines, something that could be ignored. Joly interrupted that perception immediately. She told the ministers that this was no joke. She said that Canadians were worried. She said that national pride was being openly attacked. And she reminded those present that they were all gathered in a sovereign country that expected respect. At that moment, she redefined the entire tone of the meeting. The firm speech before the cameras didn't originate there. It had been prepared for days. And to understand why it was precisely her voice that ended up dominating that episode, it is necessary to go back many years before that international meeting, to Montreal, returning to a simple neighborhood in the north of the city where politics wasn't a distant topic discussed only on television. Politics was part of everyday life. It was in dinner conversations, in late-night phone calls, in interrupted appointments, in family debates. Mélanie Joly was born on January 16, 1979, at Fleury Hospital in the Ahuntsic neighborhood. The area was made up of quiet streets, brick-terraced houses, small corner shops, and families who knew each other by name. Her father, Clement Joly, was an accountant, but he also held important positions within the Liberal Party in Quebec. Later, he would assume responsibilities at the Canadian Air Transport Safety Authority. Her stepmother, Carol Marie Allard, had an equally intense career, a lawyer, journalist, and later a member of Parliament for Laval East between 2000 and 2004. Growing up in that family meant constantly dealing with public decisions, campaigns, political discussions, and institutional responsibilities. Politics didn't seem abstract to her. It seemed like real work, real pressure, real consequences. From an early age, Mélanie demonstrated a competitive and disciplined profile. She enrolled in the law course at the University of Montreal and graduated with honors in 2001. Shortly after, she received an achievement reserved for an extremely small number of Canadian students each year. She was selected for the Chevening Scholarship, one of the most prestigious international academic programs sponsored by the British government. This took her to Brasenose College, where she obtained a Master of Laws degree. Compared to Publico in 2003, the experience at Oxford broadened her international perspective and solidified a characteristic that would later mark her entire political career. She learned to navigate high-pressure environments without losing objectivity. Upon returning to Canada, she joined the Quebec Bar Association and began working at two of Montreal's most respected law firms, first at Stikeman Elliott, then at Davies Ward Phillips and Weinberg. It was there that a connection emerged that many years later would gain an almost symbolic significance. One of her mentors during that period was Lucien Bouchard, a historical figure in the Quebec sovereigntist movement, a man known for navigating the most delicate constitutional discussions in Canadian history for decades. He was the one who wrote her letter of recommendation for Oxford. The contrast is curious. A leader associated with Quebec sovereigntism helping to shape a future minister who would become one of the strongest voices in defending Canadian sovereignty against external pressures. But Joly's political trajectory never followed predictable paths. In 2013, she decided to do something many considered too daring. Without waiting for traditional party protection, she founded her own municipal party called Real Change for Montreal and launched a candidacy for mayor of the city. She didn't have a consolidated political machine. She didn't have a historical network of municipal power. She was competing against Denis Coderre, an influential veteran of the Liberal Party. Still, she surprised everyone. She finished the election only a few points behind him and surpassed more experienced candidates. She lost the race, but she gained national prominence. Instead of disappearing politically after the defeat, she transformed that result into a platform for something bigger. 2 years later, she ran for the federal parliament for the Ahuntsic-Cartierville district, precisely the region where she grew up. She won by a wide margin, and she has remained there ever since. Over the years, she has held various ministerial positions related to cultural heritage, tourism, official languages, and economic development, until, in October 2021, Justin Trudeau appointed her Minister of Foreign Affairs. It was in this position that her international reputation truly began to solidify. She developed an unusual style by traditional diplomatic standards. She spoke directly. She used legal precision. She didn't show excessive concern in smoothing over political discomfort, and that style had been honed over decades. In public debates in Montreal, in academic discussions at Oxford, in the corridors of the Canadian Parliament, when Marco Rubio sat before her in Malbaie, she already carried more than 20 years of silent preparation. But the international scenario surrounding that meeting was even more explosive than it seemed in the headlines. At the beginning of 2025, the relationship between Canada and the United States was going through one of the tensest periods of recent decades. Everything began to escalate rapidly when Donald Trump publicly revived the idea that Canada should become an official part of the United States. On January 7, 2025, he made the first broad statement suggesting this possibility. The speech caused immediate shock in Ottawa. Joly responded the same day on social media, stating that the comments demonstrated a total misunderstanding of what made Canada strong. She declared that the Canadian economy was strong, that the Canadian people were strong, and that the country would never back down in the face of threats. The message went viral immediately. Millions of views, thousands of shares. However, January still seemed far from an open crisis. March was different. In March, the situation had moved from the rhetorical field to the economic one. Trump initiated an aggressive tariff policy against Canadian products. General tariffs of 25% began to affect imports from Canada. The scale of the impact was gigantic because approximately 3/4 of Canadian exports depended on the American market. It was no longer just provocative comments. It was concrete economic pressure capable of affecting jobs, businesses, and entire industrial chains. Joly classified the situation as an existential threat, and he used this term not as an emotional exaggeration, but as a structural definition of the economic risk faced by the country. Ottawa reacted immediately by imposing retaliatory tariffs on tens of billions of dollars worth of American products. Then came new measures affecting vehicles manufactured in the United States, replicating the same 25% rate applied by Washington on foreign automobiles. None of these actions were symbolic. Each value had been calculated to affect sensitive sectors of the American economy. The trade conflict was beginning to take on the contours of a much larger political confrontation. Then came the interview that further inflamed the diplomatic atmosphere. On the 13th of March, Trump appeared on Fox News and stated that Canada was one of the most unpleasant countries to negotiate with. He said that Canada would function better as an American state. He said that the United States didn't need anything sold by Canadians. The statements were broadcast just hours before the final session of the G7 meeting in Quebec. The following morning, Mélanie Joly crossed the hotel's historic hall and walked towards the podium, where the microphones were already on. But what no one realized at that moment was that the behind-the-scenes tensions of the meeting had been even more tense than the public press conference would later reveal. During private meetings between foreign ministers, European representatives tried to assess to what extent Trump's statements represented electoral strategy or real future political intentions. Some believed that everything would disappear after a few months. Others were beginning to see a more dangerous pattern. Joly had no doubts. According to later accounts, she repeatedly insisted that Canadian sovereignty needed to be treated as a serious matter and not as a diplomatic joke. In private meetings, she warned international colleagues that Canadian public opinion was changing rapidly. Nationalist sentiment was growing, distrust of the United States was growing, and the pressure on the Trudeau government was also intensifying. What made the situation even more delicate was the fact that Canada and the United States had one of the largest trade relations on the planet. The economies were deeply integrated. Production chains crossed borders daily. American companies depended on Canadian raw materials. Canadian companies depended on the American consumer. A sudden break could trigger unpredictable consequences, and it was precisely this scenario that was beginning to frighten international diplomats. In Malbaie, while journalists waited outside the main hall, advisors rushed through the corridors, trying to coordinate joint responses among the G7 allies. Some European governments were uncomfortable with the possibility that the meeting would turn into an indirect confrontation between Ottawa and Washington. Others believed that the tension needed to be contained quickly before it affected global markets. But Mélanie Joly seemed determined not to soften the situation. She wanted to make it absolutely clear that Canada would not accept comments about annexation as a mere political spectacle. And that explains why those 11 seconds in front of the cameras had such a huge impact. Because they didn't seem like just a diplomatic response. They seemed like a boundary being drawn publicly. They seemed like a line drawn before the entire world. The viral video became an instant symbol within Canada. On television programs, commentators stated that finally someone had responded with firmness proportional to the American statements. On social media, thousands of Canadians began sharing patriotic messages accompanied by Joly's speech. In Quebec, a province historically marked by debates about identity and sovereignty, the moment took on an even deeper meaning. Many observed the historical irony. A minister from Montreal, politically trained by figures linked to Quebec nationalism, was now becoming one of the main defenders of Canadian unity and sovereignty in the face of American external pressure. And there was another important factor making everything even more sensitive. Justin Trudeau himself was facing increasing political wear and tear at that time. Surveys indicated economic dissatisfaction in various regions of the country. The increase in trade tensions with the United States heightened nervousness among business owners, industrial workers, and investors. Every public statement had the potential to affect financial markets. Therefore, many expected Ottawa to adopt a more moderate stance. But Joly chose the opposite. She chose absolute clarity. In the days following the G7 meeting, American diplomats tried to soften interpretations of Trump's remarks. Some Republican allies argued that the president was merely using provocative language typical of political campaigns. However, within Canada, public perception had already changed. The issue ceased to seem improbable or folkloric. It was now being treated as a serious rhetorical threat against Canadian national identity. In subsequent interviews, Joly continued to reinforce the same position. She stated that Canada respected the United States as a historical partner, but would never allow any questioning of its sovereignty. And the more she repeated these statements, the more her political image strengthened internally. analysts began to observe that this crisis could redefine entire political careers within Canada. Some saw Joly emerging as one of the most prominent figures, influential figures of the new liberal generation. Others believed that the escalating tension with Washington could completely reshape Canadian foreign policy in the following years. Meanwhile, the population followed each new chapter, as if witnessing a historic transformation in relations between the two countries. Because for decades Canada and the United States were presented to the world as inseparable partners. Open borders, intense economic cooperation, constant cultural integration. But in 2025, something seemed different. For the first time in a long time, Canadians heard an American president repeatedly talk about absorbing the country as an American state. And they heard this while massive economic tariffs were being implemented simultaneously. The combination of the two factors produced an unprecedented sense of national vulnerability. Debates about economic independence began in Canadian universities. Discussions about trade diversification to reduce dependence on the United States emerged in political programs. Business leaders began to pressure Ottawa for more aggressive responses. And it was within this environment that Mélanie Joly's figure gained unexpected relevance, because she spoke in a language that many Canadians wanted to hear at that moment. Direct, without hesitation, without an excessively conciliatory tone. In Ottawa, advisors close to the government privately stated that the Malbaie episode represented only the beginning of a much tougher diplomatic phase between the two countries. The problem wasn't just the tariffs, nor was it just Trump speeches. The problem was the gradual erosion of mutual political trust, and regaining that trust would be much more difficult than simply removing trade tariffs. Behind the scenes at the G7, some European officials also began to express concern about the international impact of that crisis. If the United States and Canada entered into a prolonged trade war, the effects could impact global markets, industrial chains, and important multilateral negotiations. Furthermore, the conflict weakened the image of Western unity at a time of increasing international geopolitical instability. Therefore, many observers began to see the Malbaie meeting not just as an isolated diplomatic episode, but as a symbolic milestone in a broader shift in the political balance of power in North America. And at the heart of that moment was the image of a Canadian minister facing international cameras, without notes, without hesitation, and without any attempt to soften the message. Canada's sovereignty is not up for debate. Period. Those words continued to resonate long after the Fairmont ballroom emptied. They continued to be played on international broadcasts. They continued to fuel political debates. They continued to symbolize a shift in tone that few had predicted just months before. Because sometimes historic moments don't last hours. Sometimes they last only a few seconds in front of a microphone already turned on while the whole world is paying attention.